I'd like to introduce you to Hank. Hank is a dog I'm going to be working with over the next 2 weeks, and I'm going to be making a mini-series. Some of Hank's issues are reactivity and aggression towards dogs, intense leash biting. He scent marks on pretty much everything inside and outside the house. He pulls like a truck, destructive behaviour, and also he's got no prior formal training. As this series develops, you guys can hopefully follow along and you can watch as we progress with Hank, and you can see his training from the start to the finish. I'm going to be explaining this as I go along so you can see my training sessions with Hank and then understand my thought process behind the reason I'm doing certain things. Alright, let's get started. This is day 1 with Hank. Because I have more time to spend with Hank, I can spend longer building up a better foundation with him before trying to tackle the more serious issues. Part of good dog training is having a really good bond with your dog and a really positive relationship. What I spend today doing is still trying to figure him out, but then keep trying to work on his relationship and then work on a clear line of communication. And one of the clearest ways we can communicate with our dogs is through markers. If you don't know what a marker is, markers in dog training is marking a very specific moment in time to let your dog know they're either doing something right or they're doing something wrong. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying the word yes and then throwing down a treat or giving him a treat so that he starts to have that association with yes means something good is coming. And what I just did there is I tested out the word to see if it'd come running, and now I will do that again later on, and you can see the difference and you can see the dog start to actually understand what the word yes means. When we're first teaching a marker, what we need to do is we need to reward random behaviours. So Hank, whatever he's doing, if he looks at me in any way, I give him a reward, but the way it works is you have to say the word, then the physical action. Because if you do it the other way around, the word loses a lot of meaning. So it's word followed by the action, because dogs learn more through body language than they do verbally. So because we've spent a little bit on this session and a little bit on the last session, he's starting to understand it, so I decided to move into luring and doing a little bit of just fun obedience to just get him to going around, seeing how he follows my hand and making it really fun and engaging experience for him. This helps with our relationship, so I can figure out the best way to work with him, and also he learns that listening to me or following me, good stuff happens. As you can tell, he's very enthusiastic, which I absolutely love. Now, luring is a technique we can use to manipulate the dog into certain positions like sitting, down, spin, heel, all of that sort of stuff. By encouraging them to follow our hand, especially when it has food in it, where dogs will use their nose to pretty much follow it around, and then we can use a marker to mark that behaviour and let them know they're doing something right. Not all dog trainers use food luring, but I think for every average pet owner is probably the simplest way to get into it and start to use that and understand it. Okay, so with luring, I'm trying to encourage Hank to, as I said, follow my hand, but also sit by my side and follow me by my side. I'm being incredibly relaxed about this, one, because I'm not trying to do any high-end obedience with him. And second of all, I'm rewarding every single time he tries. You can always start off rough and then refine it as you go along and really nail it later. But right now, the important thing for me working with Hank is causing a good association and rewarding him. One of the issues I see that's quite common when I've worked with reactive dogs is that when a dog sits, they sit in front of you. Now, the issue with a dog always being in front of you, it means they're less likely to be following you. And when you've got a reactive dog, if they can follow your body language a little bit more and they see how you react, that can help massively with calming them down. So with reactive dogs, a lot of the time you'll see that the dog is in front of the owner and the dog explodes and they get really reactive. What we can do to help mitigate that is bring the dog down by your side and encourage them to be slightly behind you so they're paying more attention to you in the first place. It allows you to control the situation much better, you can do turn-ins, and you're a lot better with leash pressure as well, which can cause a dog to explode and become more reactive, which is something that Hank does. So with the luring as well, that's why I'm encouraging him to be by the side, but I'm being very relaxed about it because I've got time to work on it. This is also why Hank is off lead, because he's motivated enough, he doesn't really get distracted, and he wants to work. So I'm quite comfortable just doing this a bit more free and a bit more fun. Later on we can add in the lead. So one of the reasons I got him to go in between my legs is because originally I tried it and he was not going to go through. That was the day before, and now he does. For a dog to be able to come through your legs, they need to be able to have a certain level of confidence with that. Dogs having someone else or another dog towering over the top of them is a very intimidating thing. So there needs to be a level of trust there for that to work, as well as it can help massively with later on doing different tricks and obedience and stuff. This is where it gets a little bit interesting. So I start practicing heel because I can get him into position, and then we can start doing heel, which we'll also be using later on to help with reactivity once he really nails it. Watch my hand while we're doing this. I start moving, he's still sitting, and then as I lift up my hand, it encourages him to follow. This is what I mean by the body motion, body language, and also luring. That little flick of a wrist was all that's needed to get him to come. We're only starting this off at about 3 or 4 steps to get started, and it's super rough, but it's absolutely fine. You can also hold your hand down in front of a dog's face just to get him into that specific position. With Hank, it feels like we can almost skip that step. And this is where something beautiful happens. I use a marker word that we've been working on, yes, and you notice he instantly ears twitch and he comes. Yes. That is a sign that your dog knows the marker is working. This will help with his reactivity as well. If he can look at a dog, and even if he's in front, I can say yes, and he comes back to me because he's conditioned to yes means something good's happening, I should go back to my human, we can start to desensitize him and counter condition the emotional response of him reacting to a dog to him coming back to me. And then we can use heel, so when he sees a dog, he can look at me and we can walk past in narrower spaces. And this is all sort of the groundwork which we're going to be building on. The very last sit that we did there, he absolutely nailed it, and I was so happy with that. He got extra praise. The better the dog does, the better the job the dog does, the bigger reward. Because we ended on such a high note, I was like, cool, we'll move on to something else. I always like to end a training session with play. And because my initial assessment, I thought Hank has a possibility of resource guarding. So what you'll notice, every single time he has the ball, and I want the ball, I want to trade him something of either equal value or higher value. One of the reasons dogs resource guard is because they feel like they are going to lose. If you have something you really like, and every time you picked it up, I came over and tried to grab it out your hands and walk away, eventually you'd start moving away, and if I keep following you, and then eventually you'll probably just slap me around the face, and then you get labelled as aggressive. But in fact it's not actually aggression, it's just being pushed to the point where you feel the need to defend yourself to claim something. So the best the best cure for resource guarding is preventing it from happening in the first place. So you never need to deal with it later on, which is why with Hank, every single time I take something off of him, I'm going to offer him something of equal or higher value, which is why I spent the time assessing what he needed in the first place. This also causes him to have a more positive association with my hands coming near his face, and it practices the game and also we can use this as a game to start understanding scatter feeding, which again we can use to help him with reactivity. And with resource guarding as well, I think it's very important to pick your battles. If a dog has got a leaf in your mouth, is it going to kill them? Probably not. You can still trade for it, but I wouldn't just take it out meaninglessly. All of that can have a side effect later down the road. There is also a genetic component when it comes to resource guarding, so it's not always a person's fault. Sometimes dogs are just more prone to it. So we've now done markers and luring, and we're going to be moving on to a next thing that I think can be really helpful with reactive dogs and dog training in general, which is leash pressure. So leash pressure is something that can cause a dog to be actually more reactive. If you do not have a clear line of communication when you're using leash pressure, it can very easily trigger the fight or flight response of a dog, which can cause them to react, which is why I'd never personally recommend allowing 2 dogs to meet on lead, because they both know that they can't run away, so the tension raises dramatically. When we're teaching leash pressure for the first time, you want to try and find like a biting point. And what I mean by biting point is it's very similar to driving a bike or riding a car. Riding a car? Either way, you get what I mean. So when you're turning on the accelerator, you get to a certain point and the bike starts to move. So as you pull tension on the lead very gently, you'll get to a moment where your dog turns around, they look at you, if they're in front, and then they start coming towards you, and you can entice them in. And the second you do that, you drop the leash pressure and you mark and you reward. And the dog will, and after you do this with enough repetitions, the dog will learn that this is how I turn off pressure. You can also do it in cases where you ask the dog to sit, for example. But before you ask the dog to sit, you gently pull the lead up, and then you say sit, and then the second they go to sit, you release the pressure and you mark and reward. And this is how you can start to introduce leash pressure into your training. And as I already said, I think it can be really, really helpful for a dog to understand that. So when there is a tense situation or they start pulling, you've put in the work in a controlled environment and allow them to come back to you. And we can teach them that coming back to you is the positive thing, and to stop doing what they're doing by turning on and off the pressure. So that's a very, very brief nutshell explanation of leash pressure, and you can sort of see how little it takes. And as you get better, and your dog understands it more, you can use less and less pressure up until it's just a little tweak and they're like, oh cool, that's what I'll come back to. So we do this for about 4 minutes. Hank was doing really, really well, and then we also actually start doing a little bit of hill training. So when watching this back, I've realised I should have rewarded him a lot more when we're doing hill training or anything slightly more advanced. I also was not paying close enough attention to him when he started getting a little bit bitey. You can tell he's not fully comfortable with the collar around his neck because he keeps sitting down and scratching, and he doesn't usually do that. So it's obviously causing a small bit of irritation, which would add on to the frustration. So I knew that Hank was a lead biter. I just didn't realise to what extent, and I assumed that in this environment he would be absolutely fine. I'm going to skip forward here. So he bites the lead a little bit there, but I keep going. I think he's going to be absolutely fine. But he starts to get more and more worked up by this, up until the point where pretty much I can't actually train him that well because of how much he's shaking and pulling, and how we don't have that relationship enough to switch it off. Now the issue when the dog starts biting the lead like this is if you pull back, you pretty much enter a game of tug of war, and it makes it rewarding for them. Go with a lead, they can either shake it off and run around with it, or if you're outside, you let go, they can run out into the road and do absolutely whatever. And Hank is actually one of the worst lead biters I've ever seen, and also I've never seen a dog be this frustrated. And this is where it comes down to, I think, if you look at reactivity on a spectrum, on one end you have got fear and anxiety based reactivity. On the complete other end of the spectrum you have aggression and dominance. And in the middle you have frustration and excitement. So Hank is leaning more towards the, I think, frustration side of things. He leans a little bit more towards the aggressive side, because if he was off lead, his owner reckons he'll run off and actually go and try and bite a dog, even though they haven't done anything. And if you're working with more fear and reactive side, to me, a fearful dog isn't going to take every opportunity they can to charge another dog. And this alters how we need to do our training a little bit. So with the leash biting and stuff, I decided to try and distract him with a ball, because I know that's the thing he values the most. And I'm wondering if I can work with him with a ball in his mouth while we're doing leash pressure. But me, it was too soon to be doing that amount of things without having a clear line of communication and without being able to reward him for treats. So I start to wrap up the session because he's getting a little bit frustrated. Now, because his leash biting is so bad, I cannot do any way I normally train a dog. I would normally quite happily do leash pressure in the garden, lots of positive reinforcement, and I will teach them to walk and to hill in a no distraction environment. The issue with Hank is he gets very frustrated for whatever reason and he lashes onto the lead. So I had to think about how to tackle this. With the leash biting being as bad as it is, a bit of a thinking session, and I thought, what would be the best way to deal with this? And a lot of people are going to disagree with it, and that's absolutely fine because there's multiple ways to tackle different issues. But I decided I was going to teach Hank how to play tug of war. And when we start playing tug of war, I'm eventually going to be able to teach him to drop on command, so he lets go of whatever's in his mouth, and then he gets rewarded for doing that. It's going to take a little bit of time to get in the process of that, as you're going to see right here. I say the word drop, then throw the food on the ground, or show him the food to give him the option of doing that. And then, similar to the luring and being able to get him into a position, we're then able to eventually lower down the lure, and then we just say drop and he gets a reward. So the reason I decided to go for a tug of war is I cannot see Hank stopping biting on the lead anytime soon. Because it's frustration based, I would prefer him to have a more positive outlet, and that's one of the reasons why I'm doing tug of war. So it's learning that he can still do it in a very structured way at the right time and the right place. It's like if your dog chases a rabbit, you're going to stop playing ball with him just because of doing that. The behaviour's already happening, so I'd much rather him understand that the behaviour can happen when I say it can happen, and we use it as a reward, and then also teaching him the other aspect of it, which is impulse control, and when I do say drop, he can actually drop it. So that's the reason I decided to start going with tug of war. As you can see here, I'm trying, it's not really happening, drop it, boom, gets it. And because he's conditioned to the marker by this point, not insanely well, but he's already starting to understand it, he knows that he's doing something right when he lets go. And the plus side of this as well is we can work on impulse control in two different ways. One is by initiating play, and we can start making him wait before playing, and then he plays when we say we can play, and that is also another reward for doing another behaviour. And then the other aspect of it is the impulse control of being able to let go. Hank, similar to a child, I don't always like child comparisons, but he can't control his emotion. So if we give him enough obedience and impulse control, then hopefully we can start working through that together with him, and we can also start to have a more positive association with everything going on around him. So that's the reason why I chose tug of war. I know a lot of people are going to disagree and say I'm pretty much encouraging the behaviour, which is a very, very fair point, but to me it's very, very similar to how we toilet train. Just because you teach a dog to pee outside, that doesn't mean they come in the house and they start peeing everywhere. We are able to work with dogs and teach them an on and off switch for behaviours. Same way if you encourage your dog to bark, that doesn't mean they're going to bark the whole time. But if you do teach them to bark, you can then also teach them to stop barking. So one of the reasons I decided to teach Hank tug of war as opposed to going down another route, because obviously we can always reinforce behaviour or we can punish a behaviour. Reinforcement increases the likeliness of it happening, punishment decreases the likeliness of that happening. The issue is I'm quite comfortable using a leash correction or a leash pop. But for Hank, it's a little bit different. And the reason it's a little bit different is because he gets frustrated around the lead, pulling on the tension. So for me, making an object a little bit more frustrating at this given time is not going to have any benefits. And the other aspect of that as well is if he does get hold of a lead, there's not going to be a way I can use a physical correction like that unless I was to use something a lot more aversive, such as hitting, bonking, or even a spray bottle. And I think we're all quite past those ideas and doing that sort of training stuff. Or an e-collar could have been another choice here, but for me, I wouldn't use an e-collar for this sort of behaviour when we've still got alternatives that we can really, really work on. And if you really disagree with me, subscribe and you can watch this as we go. So this has been my first full day with Hank. And as you can see, it's starting to become a little bit more interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing how this goes. I'm going to be talking about something that doesn't get talked about enough when it comes to dogs and reactivity and behavioural issues, and that is diet. If you feed your kid M&Ms and Smarties and that's all they eat, and then they go into school and they're like, I can't focus. It's like, no shit, Sherlock. You're just hyped up on sugar. So we don't really think about diet with dogs, and that's something we do need to start doing. So we've got the Moist and Meaty, which I think is just like a budget brand, and then we've also got Pedigree. Pedigree is sort of like the dog version of McDonald's, and it should not be something that your dog eats. So if you have a look at that, composition meat and animal derivatives, including 4% chicken, 4% liver. You don't know what other animals are in it. Then cereals. Dogs should not be eating cereals, and as much as possible should be avoiding grain, as their bodies struggle to break it down. It also doesn't say which vegetables are in it. So if a product doesn't really tell you what's in it, that's an indication that they don't want you to know what's in it because it's not very good. Now if we have a look at this kibble as well, the first ingredient isn't even meat, it's whole grain wheat. That is a major, major red flag. Meat and animal derivatives, again, doesn't tell you what is in it. And then it says various sugars. Dogs do not need sugar in their diet. I'm not hating. A lot of people don't know this. I only found out about it a few years ago, but diet is a massive contribution in health and mental health. Physical health and mental health. So what we've done we've got him this brand. Rottie. I've never heard of it. As you guys know, I normally live in Cambodia. So the food branding is a little bit different, but on a general basis, if you have a look at this in comparison, this is sort of like a mid-range of dog food. It's actually pretty cheap compared to some of the better brands, but it's still pretty good. First of all, it actually lists every single ingredient you've got in here, and it's got things like milk thistle, turmeric, marigold. I think it's got nettle in it as well. And if you have a look at this fish, minimum 26% white fish, 8% fresh pearly. Then it's got potato and pea starch. So the big thing is, while it's carbohydrates, it's not grain, and I think dogs do better when they're not on grain, as their body doesn't break it down properly. So this, I'm going to be testing them out on this, and it's, as I said, it's not too expensive, and if you're trying to fix reactivity, check out diet. And because we know Hank likes to chew and he likes to bite things now, we've also got him a few extra things. So this is coffee wood, beautiful bit of wood, doesn't split, so that can be really, really good, especially if you're vegan and you don't want to use an animal product. Dogs, some dogs will love this, some might not. Very safe. We've also got deer antler. Deer antler is like a gold for dogs. Absolutely love it. From my understanding, they don't kill the deers. The deers just naturally shed their antlers, and then they pick it up, do some stuff with it, and then you can get that. Sorry. And then the last thing we've got is the Kong. I'm not sponsored by Kong. I'm also not sponsored by Rottie. It'd be awesome if I was. Kong, hit me up. Kongs can be really, really good puzzles. Different colours mean different strengths. Black is the toughest, hardest one to get through. And if you do use a Kong, make it easy to start, teach your dog how to use it properly, and this can be great after walks to get your dog to calm down. The same with this, and both of these, all of these can be used for crate training. If you did make it to the end, thank you very much, really do appreciate that, and hopefully you've learned something that's been helpful. If you're interested in following Hank's journey, subscribe, and I'll be posting the second day video as soon as possible.